Imagine this. You're a beautiful young woman living in the year 1520. You've just been captured from your homeland in the Caucasus region and brought to the most powerful palace on earth. As you walk through the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, your silk slippers make no sound on the polished floors. The elderly woman beside you leans in close and whispers something that makes your blood run cold. What she's about to tell you isn't just palace etiquette or fancy manners. These are the bedroom rules that will control every single intimate moment of your life. And if you break them, you'll disappear forever. Here's the thing most people don't realize. The Ottoman Empire didn't just conquer lands and build armies. They turned human sexuality into a weapon of absolute control. For over 600 years, the Ottoman harem operated under bedroom rules so bizarre and controlling that they would shock you into complete silence. These weren't suggestions. They weren't guidelines you could bend or break when nobody was looking. They were laws enforced by a complex hierarchy of women who literally held life and death power over hundreds of concubines. And today I'm going to tell you exactly what those rules were. You might be thinking, come on, how bad could it really be? Let me put this in perspective for you. These rules were so extreme that a single night of intimacy could end a woman's romantic life forever. One pregnancy could transform a lover into a political prisoner, and one mistake in the bedroom could literally cost someone their head. What you're about to discover comes from Ottoman palace records that have been preserved for centuries. We're talking about diplomatic accounts, architectural evidence, and detailed documentation that reveals exactly how an empire turned love into a strategic weapon. In the next 2 hours, I'm going to walk you through 8 of the most shocking bedroom rules that govern the Ottoman harem. We'll start with the rule that was perhaps the most psychologically devastating of all: the fact that no woman, regardless of how much the Sultan loved her, was ever allowed to spend an entire night in his bed. Then we'll dive into how one Ukrainian woman, named Harem Sultan, broke this sacred rule and changed history forever. We'll explore the cruel mathematics of imperial reproduction, where having a son meant gaining political power, but losing romantic access forever. You'll learn about Sultan Ibrahim's bizarre obsessions that led to recruitment campaigns involving golden cow replicas, and we'll uncover the surveillance systems built right into the palace walls that made privacy nothing more than an illusion. Trust me when I say this, by the time we're done, you'll understand why the Ottoman harem wasn't a paradise of luxury and pleasure, but a carefully designed system of psychological control that reduced human beings to political chess pieces. So grab a coffee, get comfortable, and prepare to learn about bedroom rules so strange they seem like they came from a nightmare instead of real history. Because everything you thought you knew about the Ottoman harem is about to change. Let me ask you something. What's the most intimate part of a romantic relationship? Most people would say it's not actually the physical intimacy itself, but what happens afterward. It's the pillow talk, the falling asleep together, the waking up next to someone you care about. It's those quiet moments when people are most vulnerable and honest with each other. The Ottoman Empire understood this better than any modern psychologist. That's exactly why they created the first and most devastating bedroom rule of the harem. No concubine, regardless of her beauty or the Sultan's affection for her, was ever permitted to spend an entire night in the ruler's bedchamber. Think about how calculated this cruelty really was. The moment the Sultan fell asleep, literally the second his breathing became deep and regular, the woman beside him had to quietly gather her belongings and return to her designated quarters in complete darkness. No goodbyes, no lingering touches, no whispered words of affection. Now, you might be wondering why this rule existed in the first place. The official reason given in Ottoman documents was to maintain the Sultan's sleep quality and ensure his readiness for state duties. But here's where it gets really dark. The real reasons had nothing to do with the Sultan's comfort and everything to do with maintaining absolute imperial control. First, by preventing overnight stays, the palace hierarchy ensured that no concubine could engage in pillow talk that might influence political decisions. Imagine if a woman the Sultan cared about started whispering advice about military campaigns or diplomatic treaties. That kind of influence could shift the balance of power in the entire empire. Second, the isolation prevented emotional bonds from forming. The system was designed to keep the Sultan's heart as distant as his mind from the women who served his physical needs. Love was treated as a security threat because love makes people unpredictable, and unpredictable rulers are dangerous to established power structures. But here's what makes this rule even more psychologically brutal. The enforcement wasn't just about guards watching from hidden passages. The women themselves were trained to internalize this rule so completely that they would voluntarily leave even if no one was watching them. Palace training manuals, preserved in the Ottoman archives, describe how new concubines were conditioned to associate staying past the Sultan's sleep with mortal danger. They practiced creeping out of bedrooms in complete silence, moving through darkened corridors without making any sound that might wake the guards or other palace residents. Picture this scenario for a moment. You've just shared an intimate encounter with the most powerful man on earth. Maybe for the first time in months of palace life, you felt a genuine human connection. The Sultan was kind to you, spoke gently, maybe even seemed to care about you as a person, rather than just a beautiful object. Then he falls asleep beside you, and you know you have maybe minutes before you must disappear from his life completely. You can't wake him to say goodbye. You can't leave a note or any sign that you were ever there. You just have to gather your silk garments, slip your feet into your soft shoes, and creep away like you were never anything more than a dream. The psychological impact of this rule was devastating and completely intentional. Women who experienced genuine affection during these encounters found themselves in impossible emotional situations. They were encouraged to please the Sultan and make him happy, but forbidden from forming the emotional connections that would make that happiness feel real or meaningful. Palace physicians' reports from the era describe what they called night melancholy, a condition affecting concubines who had difficulty adjusting to the overnight departure rule. Symptoms included insomnia, loss of appetite, and what we would now recognize as clear signs of depression and anxiety disorders. But here's where the story gets even more twisted. The rule created a bizarre competitive dynamic among the concubines themselves. Women who followed the overnight rule perfectly were praised by the Valida Sultan and other palace authorities. They received better living quarters, finer clothes, and more frequent rotation opportunities. Meanwhile, women who showed signs of emotional attachment or difficulty leaving the Sultan's chambers were marked as problematic. They might find their rotation opportunities reduced or eliminated entirely. In extreme cases, they could be transferred to servant duties or even sold to other households. This created a situation where the women most capable of providing genuine affection and emotional connection were systematically weeded out of the system. The Sultan was left with partners who were skilled at physical intimacy, but emotionally distant by design and training. The documentation of this rule's enforcement reveals just how seriously the Ottoman court took emotional control. Palace records include detailed reports on individual concubines' compliance with departure protocols. Guards filed written accounts noting exactly how long women took to leave chambers, whether they showed signs of reluctance, and any behavior that suggested emotional attachment. One particularly chilling document from 1534 describes the execution of a concubine named Aishi, who was found hiding in a storage closet near the Sultan's chambers at dawn. She hadn't violated the rule by staying in his bed, but her attempt to remain physically close to his quarters was deemed evidence of dangerous emotional attachment. The overnight rule also served another strategic purpose that reveals the true nature of Ottoman power structures. by preventing women from witnessing the Sultan's most vulnerable moments: his sleep, his dreams, any signs of weakness or humanity. The system maintained his mystique and authority. Think about it this way. When you sleep next to someone regularly, you see them at their most human. You hear them snore. You see them toss and turn. You witness the ordinary humanity that exists behind public personas. The Ottoman system couldn't allow that kind of humanization because it would undermine the Sultan's image as an almost divine ruler. The rule extended beyond just the bedchamber itself. Women who had been with the Sultan were forbidden from discussing anything about his private behavior, his physical appearance without formal robes, or any personal details they might have observed. Violating this confidentiality requirement was treated as treason and punished by death. Palace architects designed the Sultan's private chambers specifically to facilitate these overnight departures. Hidden passages allowed women to leave without passing through areas where they might encounter guards or other palace residents. The rooms included separate entrance and exit routes, ensuring that the flow of concubines could be managed with military precision. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the overnight rule was how it trained women to treat their own emotions as dangerous enemies. Palace instruction manuals included detailed guidance on recognizing and suppressing feelings of attachment, affection, or genuine caring for the Sultan. But here's what the Ottoman court didn't anticipate. Eventually, one woman would come along who would shatter this rule completely and change the entire system forever. Her name was Harem Sultan, and her story proves that even the most carefully designed systems of control can be broken by someone willing to risk everything for love. Now, here's where our story takes a dramatic turn. In 1520, a Ukrainian woman arrived at Topkapi Palace who would completely destroy the overnight rule and fundamentally alter Ottoman harem practices forever. Her slave name was Harem, which means the cheerful one in Ottoman Turkish, but history would remember her as one of the most powerful women in imperial history. When Harem first entered the Sultan's chambers, she knew exactly what was expected of her. She had received the same training as every other concubine. She understood that the moment Sultan Suleiman fell asleep, she had to gather her belongings and disappear into the darkness. Instead, she chose to stay. Picture this moment. It's sometime in the early hours of morning in 1520. Dawn light is starting to filter through the latticed windows of the Sultan's bedchamber. Harem is lying next to the most powerful ruler on earth, watching him sleep peacefully. She knows that palace guards are monitoring the chambers. She knows that staying until morning light should cost her life, and she stays anyway. The reaction within the harem was immediate and volcanic. Senior concubines who had spent years faithfully following the overnight rule watched in horror as this newcomer openly violated the most fundamental law of imperial intimacy. These women had trained themselves to suppress every natural instinct toward emotional connection. And suddenly, someone was breaking all the rules without consequence. The Valida Sultan, who controlled every aspect of harem life, found her authority challenged by a woman who had turned bedroom rebellion into political revolution. You have to understand how unprecedented this was. The Valida Sultan's power depended entirely on maintaining strict control over palace protocols. When Harem stayed overnight without punishment, it suggested that the old rules might not be as absolute as everyone believed. Palace records describe the chaos that followed, with established concubines demanding Harem's execution, while younger women wondered if the old rules still applied to them. Some senior harem officials argued that making an exception for one woman would destroy the entire system of control that had maintained imperial stability for centuries. But here's what made Harem's situation completely different. She didn't just break the rule once and get away with it. She kept breaking it, night after night, until staying until dawn became her normal practice. And instead of punishing her, Sultan Suleiman began expecting her to stay. What Harem understood that other concubines didn't was that the overnight rule's real purpose was preventing emotional intimacy. By deliberately creating that intimacy, she was offering the Sultan something he had never experienced before: genuine companionship and emotional connection with someone who shared his most private and vulnerable moments. The palace chronicles from this period describe how Suleiman's behavior began changing in ways that alarmed court officials. He started discussing state matters with Harem during those overnight hours. He asked for her opinions on political decisions. Most shocking of all, he began treating her advice as valuable rather than treasonous. This was exactly what the overnight rule was designed to prevent. Harem had successfully turned bedroom rebellion into political influence, proving that emotional intimacy really could translate into real power within the imperial system. The other concubines watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and terror. On one hand, Harem was proving that the rules could be broken and that genuine emotional connection with the Sultan was possible. On the other hand, her success made their own compliance with traditional restrictions seem foolish and self-defeating. Now, you might be wondering how Harem managed to survive what should have been a death sentence for rule violation. The answer reveals something crucial about power, dynamics that the Ottoman court had never encountered before. Harem survived because she made herself indispensable to Sultan Suleiman in ways that went far beyond physical attraction or sexual skill. During those overnight hours when other concubines had always been required to leave, she provided intellectual companionship, emotional support, and genuine partnership that the Sultan had never experienced. Palace records indicate that Suleiman began suffering from insomnia when Harem wasn't present. Court physicians noted that the Sultan's sleep patterns became dependent on her presence, creating a situation where enforcing the overnight rule would actually harm imperial health and effectiveness. The political implications of Harem's success were staggering. For the first time in Ottoman history, a concubine was wielding real influence over imperial policy through emotional intimacy rather than just physical appeal. She wasn't just breaking bedroom rules. She was rewriting the fundamental relationship between personal affection and political power. But here's where Harem's story becomes even more revolutionary. She didn't just break the overnight rule for herself. She used her influence with Suleiman to gradually reshape harem protocols for other women as well. Under Harem's influence, the rigid overnight departure requirement was relaxed for selected concubines who demonstrated what palace documents called exceptional discretion and loyalty. This created a new tier of imperial favorites who could provide emotional companionship rather than just physical service. The changes weren't implemented all at once, which shows how carefully Harem managed her revolutionary agenda. Palace records show a gradual shift from absolute overnight departure requirements to a more flexible system that allowed certain women extended access based on the Sultan's preference and their demonstrated trustworthiness. Harem's ultimate triumph came when Suleiman broke another fundamental harem rule by legally marrying her, making her his official wife rather than just a concubine. This promotion gave her formal political status and legal protection that made her immune to punishment for rule violations that would have killed other women. The marriage transformed Harem from a rule breaker into a rule maker. As the Sultan's legal wife, she gained authority over harem policies and could officially modify the protocols that had once threatened her life. She used this power to create more humane conditions for other women, while maintaining the essential control mechanisms that kept the system stable. Palace documents from the later years of Suleiman's reign show how Harem's influence extended far beyond bedroom protocols. She participated in diplomatic correspondence, influenced military appointments, and played an active role in imperial succession planning. The overnight intimacy that began as rule violation had evolved into genuine political partnership. The most fascinating aspect of Harem's revolution was how she managed to change the system without destroying it. She proved that emotional intimacy didn't have to threaten imperial stability, but could actually strengthen it by providing the Sultan with better emotional support and more thoughtful counsel. Other concubines studied Harem's methods and began attempting their own versions of overnight rule violation. However, most of these attempts failed because they focused on copying her actions rather than understanding the strategic thinking behind them. Harem succeeded because she offered genuine value beyond rule breaking, while imitators often came across as merely rebellious without purpose. The long-term impact of Harem's revolution extended far beyond her own lifetime. Future sultans grew up expecting emotional intimacy and overnight companionship as normal parts of imperial relationships. The rigid overnight departure rule gradually evolved into a more flexible system that balanced security concerns with human emotional needs. But even as Harem was revolutionizing overnight protocols, other bedroom rules remained firmly in place. The most psychologically cruel of these was known as the one son rule, and its implications were far more devastating than anything involving overnight departures. Imagine this nightmare scenario. You've finally achieved what every woman in the Ottoman harem dreams of. You're pregnant with the Sultan's child. You're receiving better food, more comfortable quarters, and respectful treatment from palace staff. Everyone is hoping and praying that you'll give birth to a healthy baby. But you're also secretly terrified, because if that baby is a boy, your romantic life is over forever. Welcome to the most psychologically twisted rule in the entire Ottoman harem system, the one concubine, one son law. Once a concubine gave birth to a male heir, her intimate relationship with the Sultan ended permanently. Immediately. No exceptions, no appeals, no second chances. This wasn't a gradual transition or a gentle shift in status. Palace records describe how mothers of newborn princes were moved from quarters near the Sultan's bedchambers to different apartments within the vast harem complex on the same day they gave birth. Think about that for a moment. You've just endured childbirth, you're physically exhausted and emotionally vulnerable, and palace officials are literally moving your belongings to a different part of the building to ensure you can never again access the Sultan's private chambers. The rule created the most bizarre and heartbreaking dynamic imaginable. Pregnancy with a male child was simultaneously the greatest achievement and the ultimate romantic death sentence for harem women. Let me explain why this was so psychologically devastating. On one hand, giving birth to a prince transformed a concubine's entire life for the better in many ways. She gained enormous political influence as a prince's mother. She received larger apartments decorated with expensive tiles and furnished with silk-covered divans. She got her own staff of servants, increased financial support, and a level of respect within the palace hierarchy that ordinary concubines could never achieve. But she also lost forever the intimacy that had brought her to the Sultan's attention in the first place. She could watch her political influence grow while knowing she would never again feel her former lover's touch. The cruelty of this system becomes even more apparent when you consider the alternative fate of women who gave birth to daughters. These mothers retained all their bedroom privileges and could continue competing for the Sultan's attention. They could still be called for intimate rotations, still hope for overnight stays, still maintain the romantic relationship that gave their lives meaning and purpose. But they also lived with constant anxiety that their next pregnancy might produce the son that would end their intimate access forever. Palace records document the elaborate precautions these women took to prevent or delay pregnancy, using herbs, timing methods, and other techniques that turned their bodies into battlegrounds between desire and strategic calculation. Now you might be wondering why this rule existed in the first place. The official Ottoman reasoning was about preventing favoritism and ensuring fair treatment of all imperial heirs. If mothers of princes maintained romantic relationships with the Sultan, they might gain unfair influence over succession decisions or imperial policy. But the deeper truth was more sinister. The one-son rule was designed to prevent any woman from accumulating too much power by combining romantic influence with maternal authority. A prince's mother, who also maintained intimate access to the sultan, would wield unprecedented power that could threaten the established palace hierarchy. The psychological impact on the women involved was devastating and completely intentional. Palace physicians' reports describe a condition they called birth melancholy that affected mothers of princes in the weeks following their sons' births. Modern medical understanding would recognize these symptoms as severe postpartum depression, complicated by traumatic loss of intimate relationships. The physical arrangements within the palace reinforced this cruel separation with architectural precision. Mothers of princes received luxurious private suites that were deliberately located far from the sultan's chambers. These apartments were beautiful prisons that celebrated the women's political achievement while ensuring their romantic isolation. Picture walking through these quarters as a newly transformed prince's mother. Your rooms are decorated with the finest materials in the empire. You have servants attending to your every need. Your infant son is being raised with all the care and attention befitting a potential future sultan. But when you look out your windows, you can see the towers where the sultan's bedchambers are located, knowing you'll never enter those rooms again. The rule created complex emotional dynamics among harem women that poisoned relationships and fostered resentment. Women who had given birth to daughters sometimes felt bitter toward mothers of princes, envying their political status while secretly celebrating their romantic loss. Meanwhile, mothers of princes often looked with longing at women who still maintained bedroom access, willing to trade political influence for the chance to feel loved and desired again. The most heartbreaking aspect of this system was how it turned motherhood itself into a punishment for successful romantic relationships. Women who had pleased the sultan most completely, who had achieved the ultimate goal of bearing his heir, found themselves immediately cut off from the source of their happiness and fulfillment. Palace records include letters written by mothers of princes to friends and family members that reveal the psychological toll of this transition. These documents describe feelings of emptiness, abandonment, and grief that persisted for years after their sons' births. Many women wrote about feeling like they had died and been reborn as completely different people overnight. The training provided to help women cope with this transition was itself psychologically manipulative. Palace instructors taught new mothers to redirect their emotional needs toward their sons, essentially replacing romantic love with maternal devotion. The message was clear. Your value as a person now depends entirely on your child's success, not on your own desirability or happiness. But here's where the system gets even more twisted. The one-son rule created a competitive dynamic among mothers of princes that extended their harem rivalries into the next generation. Since these women could no longer compete for the sultan's romantic attention, they began competing through their sons' achievements and potential for succession. This competition often turned deadly. Palace records document numerous cases of suspected poisoning, accidents, and mysterious illnesses affecting young princes whose mothers were viewed as threats by other prince mothers. The bedroom rule that was supposed to prevent favoritism actually created a different kind of favoritism based on maternal manipulation and political maneuvering. The economic implications of the one-son rule reveal another layer of systematic control. Mothers of princes received fixed financial allowances that were generous, but not unlimited. They couldn't earn additional income through romantic favor or special treatment from the sultan. Their economic security became entirely dependent on their sons' political prospects, creating another form of psychological imprisonment. Some women attempted to circumvent the rule through various strategies that palace records document in fascinating detail. A few tried to conceal the gender of their newborns, hoping to delay the transition to prince mother status. Others attempted to maintain informal contact with the sultan through intermediaries or chance encounters in palace corridors. All of these attempts failed and often resulted in severe punishment. The palace hierarchy was determined to maintain the one-son rule's absolute nature because any flexibility would undermine the entire system of romantic control that kept the harem stable and manageable. The rule also created bizarre situations where women actively hoped for daughters rather than sons, despite the higher status associated with male births. Palace records include prayers and offerings made by pregnant concubines specifically requesting female children so they could maintain their romantic relationships with the sultan. The most telling evidence of this rule's psychological cruelty comes from architectural modifications made to Prince Mother's quarters. Palace designers installed special barriers and modified doorways specifically to prevent these women from accessing areas where they might encounter the sultan during his intimate activities with other concubines. The system was designed to ensure that mothers of princes would be constantly reminded of what they had lost while being prevented from reclaiming it. They could see other women being prepared for romantic encounters, hear the movement of concubines through palace corridors at night, and know exactly what intimate experiences were continuing without them. But as cruel as the one-son rule was, it was just one part of an even more disturbing system of control. The selection process for determining which women could even attempt to bear the sultan's children involved examinations and criteria so bizarre that they reveal the true depth of Ottoman imperial obsession with controlling human sexuality. What I'm about to tell you next will probably make you question whether these historical accounts could possibly be real. But every detail comes from Ottoman palace records, diplomatic reports, and architectural evidence that has been preserved for centuries. The selection process for determining which women could enter the sultan's bedchambers involved examinations that were more invasive and bizarre than anything you could imagine. Before any woman could be considered for intimate access to the sultan, she underwent what palace documents euphemistically called purity evaluations. But these examinations went far beyond simple virginity verification. They were comprehensive physical and behavioral assessments that reduced human beings to a collection of measurable characteristics. Palace midwives conducted examinations that palace records describe in uncomfortable detail. Women were evaluated not just for physical attributes, but for breathing patterns during simulated sleep, potential for snoring or talking while unconscious, and even the sound their movements made on different types of fabric and flooring materials. Think about how dehumanizing this process was. Imagine being a young woman, probably already traumatized from being captured and sold into slavery, then being subjected to intimate examinations by strangers who treated your body like a piece of merchandise being evaluated for purchase. The physical requirements were so specific, they bordered on the absurd. Palace records describe how candidates were measured for anatomical proportions using standardized tools, evaluated for skin texture and coloration under different lighting conditions, and tested for flexibility and endurance through what were essentially physical fitness examinations. But the most disturbing aspect of these selection criteria was how they could change based on individual sultans' personal obsessions and fetishes. And no sultan demonstrated this more clearly than Ibrahim the Mad, whose reign in the 1640s transformed harem recruitment into something that seems like it came from a horror story rather than historical fact. Here's where this story gets truly bizarre. Sultan Ibrahim developed an obsession with a specific anatomical shape after encountering a cow during a hunting expedition. Yes, you read that correctly, a cow. This fixation became so intense that it fundamentally altered Ottoman harem practices for his entire reign. Ibrahim ordered golden replicas created based on the cow's anatomy and distributed these models throughout the empire with instructions for provincial governors to find women matching these exact physical specifications. I want you to picture this scene. Imperial agents traveling to every corner of the Ottoman Empire, carrying golden anatomical models and conducting examinations to find women who matched a sultan's bizarre fixation. The recruitment campaign that followed was unlike anything in Ottoman history. Palace records describe how governors in distant provinces received official imperial decrees requiring them to examine all women of appropriate age within their territories. Local officials were given detailed measurement criteria and threatened with punishment if they failed to identify suitable candidates. The psychological impact on women throughout the empire was devastating. Families lived in terror that their daughters might match the Sultan's specific requirements and be forcibly taken to Constantinople. Some communities attempted to hide eligible women or even disfigure them to prevent imperial selection. The woman who ultimately satisfied Ibrahim's requirements was a 330-pound Armenian named Maria, who was renamed Shivakar and given a place of honor in the imperial harem. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Palace records indicate that Ibrahim's obsession with size led him to actively seek out women who met increasingly extreme physical criteria. Ibrahim's reign also introduced what palace records call the fur fetish that transformed the very architecture of the Sultan's bedchambers. Believing that animal pelts enhanced his sexual performance, he ordered expensive furs from across the empire installed in every room where he might engage in intimate activities. The palace became a bizarre menagerie of dead animals serving as erotic decor. Persian carpets were replaced by wolfskins. Silk wall hangings were covered by bear pelts. Even the ceiling decorations included suspended animal furs that created an environment more like a hunter's lodge than an imperial palace. Can you imagine being a concubine required to perform intimate acts surrounded by the skins of dead animals, knowing that this bizarre environment represented the Sultan's idea of romantic ambiance? Palace records describe how women had to be trained to move gracefully across animal pelts without slipping, and how the smell of improperly cured furs often made intimate encounters nauseating for participants. The selection criteria during Ibrahim's reign became so specific and unusual that palace officials struggled to find suitable candidates. Recruitment expanded beyond traditional sources to include women who had been previously rejected for physical characteristics that suddenly became desirable under the new requirements. But Ibrahim's obsessions weren't just about physical attributes. He also developed behavioral requirements that were equally bizarre and demanding. Women had to demonstrate their ability to remain motionless for extended periods, to make specific sounds on command, and to perform elaborate rituals involving the animal pelts that decorated his chambers. Palace training records describe how concubines spent months learning to navigate rooms filled with animal skins, practicing movements and positions that accommodated Ibrahim's fetishes while maintaining the grace and beauty expected of imperial companions. Women who couldn't master these requirements were transferred to servant duties or removed from the palace entirely. The economic cost of Ibrahim's selection criteria was staggering. Palace financial records show enormous expenditures on fur acquisition, chamber modifications, and specialized training programs. The empire was spending vast sums to accommodate one-man sexual obsessions while neglecting military and infrastructure needs that contributed to Ottoman decline. The most tragic aspect of these selection processes was how they reduced women's value to their ability to satisfy whatever bizarre criteria happened to appeal to the current sultan. Women who had been perfect candidates under previous rulers might find themselves completely unsuitable based on new requirements that had nothing to do with their intelligence, personality, or capacity for providing genuine companionship. Palace records include heartbreaking accounts of women who had spent years preparing for imperial service only to be rejected because their physical characteristics didn't match the latest imperial obsessions. Some had undergone painful modification procedures to meet previous requirements, only to discover that new standards made their efforts meaningless. The selection process also created a market for human trafficking that extended far beyond the Ottoman Empire's borders. Slave traders learned to anticipate imperial preferences and began kidnapping women who met specific physical criteria. Palace procurement records show how traders specialized in supplying particular types of women based on current imperial demands. The most disturbing evidence of how these selection criteria affected real women comes from medical records preserved in palace archives. Documents describe women who underwent dangerous procedures to alter their physical appearance, used toxic substances to change their skin color or texture, and suffered permanent injuries from attempts to meet impossible standards. Some women died from these modification attempts. Palace physicians' reports include accounts of candidates who poisoned themselves with lead-based cosmetics, suffered internal injuries from attempting to alter their anatomy, or developed infections from procedures designed to meet specific imperial requirements. The psychological screening process was equally invasive and dehumanizing. Women underwent interviews designed to assess their capacity for submission, their ability to suppress natural emotional responses, and their willingness to participate in whatever activities the Sultan might demand. Palace psychologists, yes, they had early versions of psychological evaluation, developed tests to identify women who could maintain emotional detachment while simulating passion, who could endure physical discomfort without showing pain, and who could adapt to changing requirements without showing signs of distress or resistance. The selection criteria also included family background investigations that could disqualify women based on their relatives' political loyalties, religious practices, or even physical characteristics that might be inherited by potential imperial children. Palace security officials conducted extensive research into candidates' genealogies to ensure that no problematic bloodlines entered the imperial family. But even the most rigorous selection process was meaningless without a surveillance system capable of monitoring every intimate encounter and ensuring compliance with imperial protocols. The architectural modifications made to facilitate this surveillance revealed just how far the Ottoman system would go to maintain absolute control over human sexuality. Here's something that will completely change how you think about privacy and intimacy. The Ottoman Empire didn't just create rules governing bedroom behavior. They built an entire surveillance infrastructure right into the palace, walls to ensure those rules were followed. Every intimate encounter between the Sultan and his concubines took place under constant observation by hidden watchers who could see and hear everything. The architectural design of the Sultan's private chambers was a masterpiece of disguised surveillance technology. What appeared to be luxurious intimate spaces were actually carefully constructed observation systems where privacy was nothing more than an illusion maintained at the Sultan's discretion. Hidden passages connected the bedchambers to observation rooms where trusted eunuchs could monitor encounters without being detected. These passages were built during the original palace construction, not added later, which means the surveillance system was always an integral part of imperial intimate spaces rather than a security afterthought. Think about what this means for a moment. Every concubine who entered the Sultan's chambers believed she was experiencing private, intimate moments with the most powerful man on earth. In reality, she was performing for an audience of palace officials who were documenting her every movement, sound, and expression for administrative records. The rooms themselves were designed with strategic sightlines that allowed guards to verify compliance with harem regulations without the Sultan or his companions being aware of the observation. Windows positioned at specific angles permitted external surveillance while maintaining the facade of intimate privacy. But here's where the architectural surveillance gets truly sophisticated. The famous Iznik tiles that decorated these chambers weren't merely artistic choices. They served practical surveillance purposes. Their reflective surfaces created subtle mirrors that made covert observation easier for palace administrators positioned in hidden alcoves and concealed chambers. The level of detail in this surveillance system reveals just how obsessed the Ottoman court was with controlling and documenting imperial sexuality. Palace records describe how observers were trained to note specific details about intimate encounters, including duration, positions used, vocal responses, and signs of genuine pleasure versus performed compliance. The acoustic design of the chambers was equally sophisticated. Sound channels built into the walls allowed observers to hear conversations and intimate sounds from concealed listening posts. These audio surveillance systems were so advanced that whispered conversations could be monitored and recorded by scribes stationed in adjacent chambers. The psychological impact of this surveillance was devastating for the women involved, even though most of them never knew it was happening. Palace training manuals include instructions for concubines to behave as if they were always being watched, which suggests that some women did become aware of the surveillance and lived in constant anxiety about their performance being evaluated. The observers themselves were carefully selected eunuchs who had demonstrated absolute loyalty to palace authorities and complete discretion about what they witnessed. These men underwent their own training programs to learn proper surveillance techniques, documentation methods, and protocols for reporting violations of intimate conduct rules. Palace records describe the detailed reports these observers filed after each intimate encounter. These documents included information about compliance with protocols, evidence of emotional attachment between participants, and assessments of each concubine's suitability for continued intimate access to the Sultan. But the surveillance system extended far beyond just the Sultan's bedchambers. Hidden passages connected all areas of the harem, allowing palace officials to monitor conversations, relationships, and activities throughout the women's living quarters. No area of the harem was truly private or free from potential observation. The most sophisticated surveillance technology was concentrated in areas where concubines prepared for intimate encounters. Observation points in bathing chambers allowed officials to monitor the preparation rituals, ensuring that women followed prescribed beauty treatments and behavioral protocols before meeting the Sultan. The architectural surveillance also included escape routes and emergency protocols designed to protect the Sultan if intimate encounters became dangerous. Hidden doors could be opened instantly to allow guards to intervene, while concealed weapons were positioned where observers could access them quickly if needed. This reveals something crucial about Ottoman attitudes toward imperial sexuality. Even the most intimate moments were treated as potential security threats that required constant monitoring and immediate intervention capabilities. Love and desire were never allowed to exist without the possibility of immediate, violent suppression. The lighting systems in intimate chambers were designed to facilitate surveillance while creating romantic ambiance. Concealed oil lamps provided illumination for hidden observers, while candles and decorative lamps created mood lighting for the Sultan and his companions. The romantic atmosphere was literally constructed around surveillance infrastructure. Palace records describe how the surveillance system was tested regularly to ensure optimal functionality. Officials conducted practice observations using volunteer eunuchs to verify that sightlines remained clear, audio channels transmitted sound properly, and emergency intervention protocols could be executed quickly. The most disturbing aspect of this surveillance apparatus was how it turned intimate human experiences into administrative data. Palace archives contain thousands of detailed reports describing private moments between the Sultan and various concubines, reducing personal interactions to bureaucratic documentation. The observers were required to maintain detailed charts, tracking each concubine's intimate performance, emotional responses, and compliance with palace protocols. These records were used to determine future rotation schedules, identify women who were developing problematic emotional attachments, and select candidates for special training or punishment. The surveillance system also created opportunities for corruption and blackmail that palace officials exploited for personal gain. Observers who witnessed violations of palace protocols could report them officially, or use the information for private leverage against concubines or even palace administrators. Palace security records document several cases where surveillance observers were executed for using their access to intimate information for personal benefit. These cases reveal how the surveillance system created its own security problems that required additional layers of monitoring and control. The architectural modifications required to maintain this surveillance system were enormous and ongoing. Palace construction records show continuous renovation projects designed to improve observation capabilities, expand hidden passage networks, and upgrade surveillance technology as new techniques became available. The most sophisticated surveillance installations were concentrated in chambers used for training new concubines. These areas included observation points that allowed instructors to monitor practice sessions where women learned intimate techniques, behavioral protocols, and submission methods required for imperial encounters. Think about the psychological impact on women who discovered they were being watched during their most vulnerable and private moments. Palace medical records describe cases of severe anxiety, depression, and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorders among concubines who became aware of the surveillance system. The surveillance apparatus also included provisions for recording certain encounters using primitive documentation methods. Palace scribes were trained to take detailed notes during observations, creating written records of intimate activities that were preserved for legal and administrative purposes. These surveillance records served multiple purposes beyond simple security monitoring. They provided legal documentation for establishing paternity of imperial children, evidence for resolving disputes about protocol violations, and data for improving training programs designed to produce more compliant and skilled concubines. The most extensive surveillance was reserved for women who had gained special favor with the Sultan, or who showed signs of developing emotional influence over imperial decisions. These women were subjected to constant monitoring that extended to their private quarters, personal conversations, and interactions with other palace residents. Palace records describe how the surveillance system was used to identify and eliminate security threats before they could affect imperial stability. Women who showed signs of political ambition, emotional manipulation, or loyalty to foreign interests were quickly identified through surveillance and removed from intimate access. But even the most sophisticated surveillance system was useless without precise scheduling and logistics to ensure that the right women were available for intimate encounters at the right times. The rotation system that managed these schedules operated with military precision that would impress modern organizational specialists. Imagine trying to organize a schedule that coordinates the intimate lives of hundreds of women with the sexual desires of one man while tracking menstrual cycles, pregnancy status, training progress, and political considerations. Now imagine that a single scheduling error could result in someone's execution. Welcome to the Ottoman harem rotation system, the most precisely organized sexual logistics operation in human history. The Valida Sultan, who controlled every aspect of harem life, maintained charts and documentation that would make modern project managers weep with admiration. These weren't simple calendars or appointment books. They were comprehensive databases tracking dozens of variables that determined when each woman could be available for intimate encounters with the Sultan. Palace archives contain thousands of these scheduling documents, preserved on silk scrolls and decorated paper that reveal the incredible complexity of organizing imperial sexuality. Each woman had her own detailed file tracking her menstrual cycles, pregnancy status, training level, recent intimate history, and current favor status with palace authorities. The scheduling process began each month with elaborate ceremonies where the Valida Sultan would announce the upcoming rotation assignments. Picture this scene: hundreds of women gathered in the palace's main hall, waiting to learn whether they would receive intimate access to the Sultan or spend another month in frustrated isolation. Concubines learned their assigned nights through a complex system of silk handkerchiefs that served as both notification and status symbol. Each color represented different levels of imperial favor and different types of intimate access. A gold-threaded handkerchief meant immediate bedchamber privileges, while white silk indicated a woman had fallen from favor and might never receive another opportunity. The psychological impact of this notification system was deliberately crushing. Women spent weeks preparing for rotation announcements, knowing that the color of a silk handkerchief would determine their happiness, status, and self-worth for the coming month. Palace records describe women fainting, crying, and even attempting suicide after receiving white handkerchiefs that signaled the end of their intimate privileges. The rotation schedule had to account for an incredible array of variables that modern scheduling software would struggle to manage. Palace administrators tracked each woman's fertility cycles to coordinate with imperial desires for conception or pregnancy avoidance, depending on current political needs and succession planning considerations. But here's where the scheduling gets really complicated. The system also had to consider the Sultan's own preferences, energy levels, health status, and political obligations that might affect his availability for intimate encounters. Palace physicians provided regular reports on imperial sexual capacity and recommendations for optimal scheduling frequency. The rotation system included provisions for emergency scheduling changes based on political developments, military campaigns, or diplomatic obligations that might alter imperial needs. Palace records describe how the entire monthly schedule could be reorganized within hours to accommodate changing circumstances. Backup scheduling was essential because concubines could be disqualified from their assigned nights due to illness, menstruation, pregnancy, or disciplinary issues. The Valida Sultan maintained detailed contingency lists, ensuring that imperial intimate needs could always be met regardless of individual availability problems. The most disturbing aspect of this scheduling system was how it treated women's bodies and emotions as resources to be optimized for maximum imperial satisfaction. Palace efficiency experts analyzed intimate encounter data to determine optimal rotation frequencies, preferred preparation times, and scheduling patterns that produced the best results for the Sultan. The rotation schedule also had to coordinate with other palace activities that affected concubine availability. Women undergoing beauty treatments, medical examinations, or disciplinary procedures had to be temporarily removed from rotation consideration, requiring constant schedule adjustments and contingency planning. The training implications of this scheduling system were enormous and psychologically devastating. Women had to maintain peak physical condition, emotional readiness, and sexual skill levels at all times because they never knew when they might be called for intimate service with minimal advance notice. Palace records describe the exhausting preparation routines women followed to stay rotation ready. Daily beauty treatments, physical conditioning, skill practice, and emotional conditioning were required to ensure that any woman could be prepared for intimate encounters within hours of receiving scheduling notification. The rotation system created intense competition among concubines that extended far beyond simple rivalry for the Sultan's attention. Women competed for favorable scheduling slots, tried to sabotage rivals' preparation processes, and formed alliances designed to improve their rotation opportunities at others' expense. Palace security had to monitor these competitive dynamics constantly because scheduling rivalries often led to poisoning attempts, physical violence, and elaborate sabotage schemes that could disrupt the entire rotation system. Women who had been removed from intimate scheduling became desperate and dangerous. The economic implications of the rotation system were staggering. Palace financial records show enormous expenditures on beauty supplies, clothing, medical care, and facility maintenance required to keep hundreds of women in constant readiness for potential intimate encounters that most of them would never actually experience. The scheduling system also had to account for seasonal variations in imperial preferences and capacity. Palace records show that Ottoman sultans typically followed annual patterns in their intimate choices, preferring certain types of women during specific months or festivals that corresponded to political, military, or religious cycles. Winter scheduling differed significantly from summer arrangements due to changes in palace heating, clothing requirements, and availability of certain beauty treatments that were seasonal. Palace administrators maintained separate rotation protocols for different times of year, each requiring distinct preparation and logistics considerations. The rotation schedule included provisions for special events and celebrations that might require additional or different intimate arrangements. Palace festivals, diplomatic visits, military victories, and religious observances could all trigger scheduling modifications that affected dozens of women's rotation opportunities. The most psychologically cruel aspect of the rotation system was how it created false hope and manufactured disappointment on a regular schedule. Women who received favorable rotation assignments one month might find themselves completely excluded the next month, with no explanation or opportunity for appeal. Palace records document the elaborate appeals processes that desperate women attempted when they were removed from rotation scheduling. These appeals rarely succeeded and often resulted in additional punishment for questioning palace authority, but women continued attempting them because rotation access was literally the difference between meaningful life and living death within the harem system. The rotation system also coordinated with surveillance and documentation requirements that turned intimate scheduling into administrative complexity. Observer assignments, record-keeping responsibilities, and security protocols all had to be synchronized with rotation schedules to ensure proper monitoring and documentation of imperial encounters. The scheduling administrators themselves wielded enormous informal power within the palace hierarchy because they could influence women's rotation opportunities through subtle scheduling modifications. Palace security records describe corruption cases where administrators accepted bribes or favors in exchange for favorable scheduling treatment. The rotation system had to accommodate the complex training schedules required to prepare women for intimate service. New concubines underwent 2-year training programs that had to be coordinated with rotation availability, creating scheduling challenges that required months of advanced planning. But even the most perfectly organized rotation schedule was meaningless without elaborate preparation rituals that transformed ordinary women into suitable companions for imperial intimacy. These preparation processes were themselves carefully scheduled operations that revealed the true dehumanizing nature of Ottoman imperial sexuality. What I'm about to describe to you will probably sound more like medieval torture than beauty preparation, but every detail comes from Ottoman palace records that documented the elaborate rituals concubines underwent before intimate encounters with the Sultan. These weren't spa treatments or luxury beauty services. They were systematic processes designed to transform human beings into perfect objects for imperial pleasure, regardless of the cost to their health or humanity. The preparation process began days before a woman's scheduled encounter and involved treatments that were often more painful and dangerous than the intimate activities they were designed to prepare for. Palace beauty specialists had developed techniques that prioritized visual perfection over human comfort, creating temporary beauty that came at the cost of permanent damage. Women selected for rotation underwent isolation procedures that separated them from other palace residents and placed them under constant supervision by beauty specialists and medical attendants. Imagine being locked away for days while strangers subjected your body to procedures that you couldn't refuse, couldn't modify, and couldn't escape from. The beauty treatments themselves were based on standards that changed according to individual sultans' preferences, but consistently prioritized artificial enhancement over natural appearance. Palace records describe concubines using lead-based cosmetics that created luminous skin while slowly poisoning their nervous systems and causing permanent neurological damage. Let me give you some specific examples that show just how extreme these beauty requirements were. Women underwent procedures to lighten their skin using mercury-based compounds that caused tremors, memory loss, and eventually madness. Others used caustic substances to remove all body hair, resulting in chemical burns that left permanent scarring. The pursuit of imperial beauty standards often became a form of slow suicide as women destroyed their health to maintain their positions in the rotation system. Palace physicians' reports include accounts of women who suffered liver damage from cosmetic toxins, respiratory problems from inhaling beauty, treatment fumes, and infections from procedures designed to alter their physical appearance. The dietary restrictions imposed during preparation periods were equally extreme and dangerous. Women were forbidden from eating foods that might affect their scent, taste, or physical performance, but they were also required to consume substances believed to enhance their sexual appeal or fertility, depending on imperial preferences. Palace nutritionists developed meal plans that were more like medical prescriptions than food choices. Women preparing for encounters ate specific combinations of foods, herbs, and medicines designed to alter their body chemistry, breath odor, skin texture, and even the taste and smell of their bodily fluids. The preparation timeline was rigidly structured and allowed no flexibility for individual needs or health concerns. Palace records describe how women who became ill during preparation periods were replaced by backup candidates, rather than having their treatment schedules modified to accommodate medical problems. The bathing rituals alone took days to complete and involved water temperatures and chemical additives that often caused burns, rashes, and respiratory distress. Palace bathing specialists used perfumed waters that contained toxic substances, oils that penetrated the skin and caused systemic poisoning, and soaps made with ingredients that were corrosive to human tissue. Women were bathed multiple times daily during preparation periods, with each session involving different chemical treatments designed to achieve specific cosmetic effects. The cumulative exposure to these substances often resulted in chronic health problems that persisted long after individual encounters ended. The clothing and jewelry requirements for intimate encounters were designed with symbolic meanings that reinforced power dynamics while creating additional physical discomfort for the women involved. Each garment served specific purposes beyond aesthetics, with colors indicating status, fabrics revealing favor levels, and jewelry marking position within the rotation hierarchy. The most favored concubines wore silk imported from China and gold jewelry crafted by master artisans, but these luxurious materials came with preparation requirements that were themselves forms of torture. Women had to undergo painful procedures to ensure their bodies could properly display expensive fabrics and valuable jewelry without causing damage to imperial property. The removal of these garments followed choreographed sequences that had been refined over generations of imperial encounters. Concubines learned specific undressing patterns timed to coincide with particular moments in intimate activities, creating ritualized performances that treated sexuality as ceremonial duty rather than human connection. The psychological preparation was equally systematic and dehumanizing. Women underwent mental conditioning designed to suppress their natural emotional responses and replace them with calculated performances of passion and submission that would satisfy imperial expectations without revealing genuine human feelings. Palace psychologists developed techniques for helping women dissociate from their physical experiences during intimate encounters. These methods taught concubines to mentally separate their consciousness from their bodies, experiencing intimate activities as if they were happening to someone else rather than to themselves. The training for emotional suppression included practice sessions where women learned to simulate pleasure while feeling nothing, express devotion while maintaining emotional detachment, and appear completely satisfied while experiencing physical or emotional discomfort. Palace records describe how successful preparation was measured not by the women's comfort or well-being, but by their ability to maintain perfect performance regardless of their actual physical or emotional state. Women who showed signs of genuine feeling or authentic response were considered inadequately prepared and subjected to additional conditioning. The preparation process also included rehearsals, where women practiced intimate scenarios with instructors who evaluated their performance and provided detailed critiques of their technique, emotional presentation, and compliance with imperial preferences. These practice sessions were often more invasive and humiliating than the actual encounters they prepared for. The medical examinations conducted during preparation were designed to ensure optimal imperial satisfaction rather than women's health and safety. Palace physicians checked for any physical conditions that might interfere with intimate activities, but they also administered drugs and treatments designed to enhance performance, regardless of health consequences. Women received injections of substances believed to increase sensitivity, flexibility, or endurance during intimate encounters. Many of these treatments had dangerous side effects that palace physicians considered acceptable costs for improved imperial pleasure. Palace medical records document cases of permanent injury and death resulting from preparation procedures. The final preparation stages involved isolation periods where women were kept in sensory deprivation conditions designed to heighten their responsiveness during intimate encounters. These isolation periods often lasted for days and included techniques that would be recognized today as psychological torture. Palace records describe how women were kept in darkened chambers, deprived of human contact, and subjected to conditioning techniques designed to make them completely dependent on imperial approval for any sense of worth or identity. The isolation was intended to break down their individual personalities and replace them with imperial compliance. The preparation rituals concluded with final examinations where palace officials verified that each woman met all requirements for imperial encounters. These examinations were conducted by panels of specialists who could reject candidates at the last moment if any aspect of their preparation was deemed inadequate. Women who failed final preparation examinations faced punishment that often exceeded the consequences of never being selected for rotation in the first place. Palace records document cases where preparation failures resulted in permanent removal from intimate consideration, transfer to servant duties, or even sale to other households. But even the most elaborate preparation rituals were just the beginning of a systematic process designed to strip away human identity and replace it with imperial compliance. The training programs that created these perfect imperial companions reveal the true scope of Ottoman efforts to control and reshape human sexuality for political purposes. Everything I've described so far, the bizarre rules, the surveillance, the preparation rituals, was just the surface of a system so systematically dehumanizing that it took 2 full years to transform a normal human being into what the Ottoman Empire considered a suitable imperial companion. What you're about to learn about the training programs will show you exactly how an empire turned the destruction of human identity into an administrative process. New arrivals to the Ottoman harem underwent intensive conditioning that palace records describe with the clinical precision of a military operation. These weren't education programs or cultural orientation sessions. They were systematic personality destruction and reconstruction projects designed to strip away individual identity and rebuild women as perfect instruments of imperial pleasure. Historical detail. Palace education records from the 1570s show detailed curricula requiring 14 hours daily of instruction, practice, and conditioning. The 2-year training curriculum included lessons in 17 different languages, advanced poetry recitation, musical performance on traditional instruments, and what palace documents euphemistically called intimate arts. But here's what those palace records don't tell you directly. Every single aspect of this education was designed to serve imperial sexual desires rather than the women's personal development or well-being. The language training wasn't designed to create educated, cultured women who could engage in meaningful conversation. It was intended to ensure that concubines could understand and respond to imperial commands regardless of what language the Sultan chose to speak during intimate encounters. Women learned phrases, responses, and behaviors in multiple languages without necessarily understanding cultural context or deeper meaning. The intimate arts training was conducted by elderly concubines who had survived decades within the system and understood exactly what imperial satisfaction required. These instructors had been selected not for their teaching ability or compassion, but for their proven capacity to produce graduates who could satisfy imperial desires without developing problematic emotional attachments. Palace training records describe how instructors taught techniques for reading the Sultan's moods through subtle facial expressions, adjusting physical responses to match his preferences, and maintaining the illusion of passionate devotion while feeling absolutely nothing at all. The training was so thorough that graduates could simulate any emotional state on command. Think about what this kind of training does to a human being's capacity for genuine emotion and authentic relationship. Women learned to treat their own feelings as dangerous enemies that could interfere with imperial satisfaction. They were conditioned to suppress natural responses and replace them with calculated performances that bore no relationship to their actual experiences or desires. The psychological conditioning included techniques that would be recognized today as systematic brainwashing. Women underwent daily sessions designed to break down their resistance to authority, eliminate their capacity for independent thought, and replace their personal identity with complete imperial loyalty. Palace records describe conditioning exercises where women practiced responding to various forms of physical and emotional